Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final book talk of 2024. Thank you for being here. I would like to start by introducing Shannon Davis, who's the Senior Acquisitions Editor at Harvard Education Press. Shannon, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Mayanne. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the Gutman Library Book Talk for From Tinkering to Transformation. As Mayanne said, my name is Shannon Davis, and I'm Senior Acquisitions Editor at Harvard Education Press. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Meredith Honig, co-author of From Tinkering to Transformation, How School District Central Offices Drive Equitable Teaching and Learning, published by HEP last November. Dr. Honig is a professor of education policy, organizations, and leadership at the University of Washington, where she also founded and directs the District Leadership Design Lab. Her research and partnerships focus on the redesign of school district central offices to ensure that all students experience an excellent and equitable education, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students living in low-income circumstances, and others historically underserved by public schools. She is co-author of Supervising Principles for Instructional Leadership, a Teaching and Learning Approach with Lydia Rainey, published by HEP in 2020, and a co-author of Learning Focused Leadership in Action, Improving Instruction in Schools and Districts, published by Routledge in 2014. Meredith, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
It is also an honor to introduce our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Cheatham, Senior Lecturer on Education here at HGSE and co-chair of the Public Education Leadership Project. A former superintendent of Madison Metropolitan School District, Dr. Cheatham has extensive practice experience in leading for equity and transformational change in school districts. She is currently the co-chair of the Collaborative on Political Leadership in the Superintendency and co-author of Entry Planning for Equity-Focused Leaders, Empowering Schools and Communities with Rodney Thomas and Adam Parrott-Schaefer, published by HEP in 2022. Welcome, Dr. Cheatham, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yes, and thank you, Gutman Library, for hosting this book talk. We will listen to your conversation and then reserve the last 15 minutes or so for a Q&A from our viewers. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Meredith and Jen.
All right, thank you. Hey, Meredith. It's
Hey,
good to
Jen, how are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited about this conversation with you. And I want to highlight just a few more things or additional things or punctuate some things about your background, because I really appreciate what it is that you do and what you brought to this book. I mean, of course, you're a researcher, a scholar who has studied a variety of policy reforms, but you also used to run the EDD program at the University of Washington. So you've worked with many doctoral students over the years who are striving to be practitioners in the field. And you are the director of the District Leadership Design Lab, which is an entity that works directly with school districts on the transformation of central office and key divisions within central office. So you bring, your research background, your background as someone who has supported doctoral students striving to become system level leaders.
Jen, we lost your volume.
Jennifer, sorry, we can't hear you.
Did I disappear there for a minute?
That was fun. It was a good start. Go ahead.
Saying that we've known each other for a long time, but even before I knew you, I was using your work as foundational to the work of the central offices and central office.
Your volume went out again.
A question that has been on my mind. Can you hear me okay?
Now we can. Yeah, it went out again.
I don't know why that's happening. I'm going to work on figuring this out. But in the meantime, let me ask you this question. You are one of the only people I know
Sorry, Jennifer, we cannot hear you again. No, sorry, we couldn't hear you. We can't hear you still.
I'm happy to get started. I know what you're going to ask me. It's amazing how that works. You were going to ask me, you're one of the only people you know, maybe the only one who thinks this much about the role of the central office in school districts. You don't exactly write this, but why the hell did I do that? I think you actually wrote, why did this become such an interest of yours, which is a much more Harvard way to say that. And how has that interest grown or changed over time? I really appreciate that question. If you asked me 20 years ago when I started this work, if I'd be looking at school districts or even looking within schools, I might have been surprised to find out that's what I was going to be doing, because I started my career, I started my work caring about school community partnerships and the relationship between community resources, community assets, and schools. And always cared about scale, always cared about policy. And so wanted to, was really thinking about how to make more of these rich partnerships I was seeing between schools and community agencies that were trying to serve whole children and really embrace historically marginalized students' cultures and knowledge as resources for their own learning, for other students' learning, and for schools. And I was working for a couple state agencies early in my career, and my charge included supporting school districts and supporting schools in realizing those kinds of projects. And through that, really early on, met amazing people working in school district central offices who were really trying to innovate, to rethink their work and do that in a way that was really responsive to what was working at the school level. And then, as I was working in these state agencies, found just a real lack of research on school district central offices generally, and specifically related to how they support schools and kind of being their best selves, being their best places for kids. And I did my first research project. My first research project, like for many people, was my dissertation. And I was working with a school district, trying to understand how, that problem that I brought from my practice. So how are school districts trying to help schools innovate, in that case, specifically around school community partnerships? And from there, really, district leaders, district staff showed me the way. So my first study was of these kind of renegade alternative central office staff people trying to use the experience of school community partnerships to leverage change in the central office. And they ran up against so many barriers as they were trying to figure out what their work is and how do they push for changes in the rest of the system. And then met central office people trying to move beyond those kinds of initiatives. They were working on new small autonomous schools initiatives, which said, okay, as a central office, we want to foster school innovation. How do we make that the main work of the system, not the work of just like an initiative,
Right.
like a school community partnership initiative? And then I just think got very lucky at that point, because we saw the limitations of trying to leverage central office change, even through a district-wide initiative. And you know this, you were in Chicago at the time, trying to do some of that work. And got lucky in the sense that we found districts that were taking the central office as the change project in and of itself. And really seeing that the central offices we have are not the central offices we need.
Right.
If we're now going to do the work school systems need to do, which is foster deeper learning and embrace diversity and foster culturally responsive teaching.
I love that, Meredith. And sorry for my tech glitches earlier. Someone came to the rescue. Thank you, Jal Meta, for sending someone over here. Jal is watching.
That's great. I have I have two teenagers at home, so I just start talking whenever there's an opportunity.
I'm so glad you just jumped in there like that. But I do want to ask you, Meredith, I mean, I love that this has become your interest, that your interest has grown over time. It'll continue to be something that you work on in partnership with school districts. But tell us a little bit more about the research that you have done. Like, how do you do it? Where do your findings come from? Tell us about the research.
Yeah, I mean, my students ask me often, how do we decide what methods to use? And I always say you start with your questions. What do you want to know? And what's the best way to know that? And what are your values? What knowledge do you value? And I have always valued the daily work of people in school systems who get up every morning and try to do the right work on behalf of kids. So so our research is very much grounded in the practice of what people are doing. So the book that we're talking about today is based on really over 1,000 hours of observations. So we sat in on meetings that sometimes people in those meetings would turn to us and say, "Why are you here? I don't want to be here." But we love those meetings of central offices, trying to do the work, trying to figure out what new work is within central offices. We shadowed people, we followed them to their cars. A lot of them just, no one ever asked them, "Hey, what do you do and how's it going?" And so it was not challenging to have people call us on their way home from work and tell us about their day and what they were working on. But it was really important that we be there in real time, observing things as they unfold. And it was also really important to us that we take a strengths-based approach. We already know, I mean, I'm a student of decades of scholarship on implementation. We already know there are many challenges to implementing anything of value in education and in other sectors. So we don't want to rediscover all that. And we don't think we need more stories of what's not working. So we try to put ourselves in districts where we think, based on other people's research, based on theory, based on just our living in the world and practice, places where we think people are doing the right work. And we assume that it's hard. And we try to pick places where the conditions seem right for it to go well. And we normalize that the work is hard and that there are challenges, and we try to understand how people navigate their way through those. But the doing of research as part of our commitments to advancing educational equity, and I know I speak for Lydia on this as well, was really important to us because we both had been in different arenas, connecting with practitioners, being in practice, and just finding major gaps in knowledge. And so we felt like this was a particular contribution we could make to the field.
That's great, Meredith. This is not a question I was planning on asking you, so bear with me. But I understand why you focus on central office because it's so overlooked, quite honestly. And I understand more based on what you just said about how you go about learning about central office, especially those who are trying to do effective work. But why is central office important? Like, what, even if they were to do their work well, like, why do we need them? Like, tell us a little bit about why they matter.
Great. And I was planning to do this. And so I am going to ask you, after I say something, to say something yourself, because you were an area officer in Chicago Public Schools. You were superintendent of Madison Public Schools. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there's increasing talk now of the importance of districts, of states across the political spectrum being kind of agents of what we care about. And especially in an equity arena, districts in the United States are just in this incredibly important position between schools and their communities and broader government. from which many resources flow despite, local funding formulas. They're just in such an essential position to understand what we know at the school level, which is often an untapped source of knowledge informing policy.
Yeah.
And to mediate for schools what is coming from the federal government, the state government, and also private funders who have major initiatives, and other potential distractors from the right work. And also in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a great amount of work that's really important about the district role in fostering research use and data use within schools. So it's just like the nexus of so many things. And because it's been so neglected,
Yeah.
there's both that challenge of not having had investment over time in building their capacity, and also this incredible potential not to do the same old thing.
Mhm.
And really think about new ways of working in that essential space.
Yeah, I love that, Meredith. I think similarly, meaning that the central office is well positioned to create the conditions for schools to do their best work on behalf of children and families. I mean, schools are so close to children and families, right? Like when it comes to kind of the granular day-to-day decision-making about what's right, like that is the school's purview, as it should be. But the central office is a place that can both provide resources, right? Not just resources, time, money, people, technology, but also they're well positioned to address barriers to progress. And I mean, I like what you said about how they also can be kind of a translator, but they can also be a hub for information exchange, right? Not just locally, right, across schools in a community, but across districts, right?
Yeah.
Like helping us, share and learn from one another. Central
Yes.
offices are really well positioned to do so. Yeah, I mean, so much potential if they function well.
For sure. And, as a student of equity scholarship, I think that scholarship also has not spent much direct time focused on central offices. In fact, when I was first starting out as a researcher, a very famous equity scholar whose opinion I deeply value and work I admire, said to me in the most loving way possible, she said, if you care so much about equity, why would you focus on central offices? And I think so I think your question is really important, because I think some people are, when things are challenging, when things aren't working, we can sometimes maybe too quickly give up on these central systems we have.
Yeah.
But, I mean, a great promise of school districts is to be the keepers of equity. And when they don't do that, they get in the way of equity. So as you know, like from the first chapter of our book, we start with a review of equity research, which doesn't name central offices, but it names just a long list of central office functions that typically interfere with
Yes.
realizing equity in schools.
Oh, yeah. Finance,
Discipline,
HR, yeah. Mhm.
all of them. And
Oh.
so we have to pay attention to that, especially since, you didn't go to work in a school district central office and say, hey, how can I get in the way of equity every day? And central office staff across the country are often that we meet to ask the exact opposite. So why is it that those systems have been so impervious to the values and the orientations of the people working there? How can we center central office staff as drivers of how those systems work?
Ooh, I love that. Okay, Meredith, let me ask you this, because the book's title is about transformation. And so we're not just talking about, well-functioning central offices. We're talking about central office transformation. tell us more about what it is and what it's not? And maybe you want to start with what it's not before you tell us what it is.
Yes, for sure. So anyone who's heard me talk before know I'm a big fan of the reorg. The central office reorganization, which is the #1 strategy of every superintendent across the country. You had a reorg. Did you love your reorg? We all reorg.
I know, yes, I've been through multiple reorgs.
Yeah.
I know what you're
And
talking about.
yeah, so central office transformation isn't the reorg. It's not, although it includes a new organizational chart, which is what we're talking about, but it's not mainly the moving around of offices. It's not the renaming of offices. And it's also not cross-functional teams or the closer connecting of central office to schools in and of itself, right? So the reorg in and of itself and decentralization strategies, cross-functional teams themselves tend not to get to transformation, which we and the people we've worked with define as fundamental shifts in the core work that central office do. So if a reorg is the result of a deep rethinking of the values that drive a central office and work realigned to those values, then it could indicate transformation. But typically it's more, here's what our new offices are, here's our staffing pattern, without the rethinking. Similarly, when, you know, in all good intentions, with all good intentions, central office staff will say, we want to be in schools more. We want to learn more from people at the school level, and then we'll know how to serve them better. And I wish that worked, but it often doesn't. And in fact, central office staff often come away from those visits with long lists of requests from principals and teachers that they can't manage. And, you know, when you were a principal, when the central office staff came and left, like, did they help you? And a lot of the principals in our studies found those visits actually really stressful. They stressed their teachers out and they took time. And it's not to say that central office staff should not be in closer contact with their schools. Of course they should. But it's more, central office transformation is about asking the question, what are we as a central office all about? What are our core values? And how are we aligning our work to those values?
Yeah.
And if you're really serious about answering that question, you take an anti-racist historical view of central office and start with a recognition that central offices were set up over 100 years ago, not to support great teaching and learning. They were set up to do other things, like manage enrollments and ensure compliance with licensure and other things. And they were also set up to socialize students in ways that really are the opposite of what culturally responsive teaching is all about. So now you've got this like 100-year-old institution that we now look to foster deeper teaching and learning, as well as embrace diversity and foster culturally responsive teaching. And just institutionally, it's not set up to do that. So this idea of transformation is about just really understanding that institutional mismatch between the central offices we have and the central offices we need, and just starting from a new set of assumptions about how the central office should work.
Yeah, I love that. In your book, you talk in one of the initial chapters about these kind of big principles. One is that the central office works in service of equitable teaching and learning, right? That is the role. That everyone in central office matters to realizing equitable teaching and learning, and that central office must work in partnership with school principals. I wonder if there are any of those premises that you would want to break down a little bit more for us, Meredith, and why they're important.
For sure. Why don't you choose? Which one stands out for you?
Well, they all stand out. Can I just say that? I mean, I know that when I was in Madison, we did a lot of work on strengthening central office. That's also true in Chicago. And when I was in San Diego, working at central office, I mean, we've always been striving to understand the role, right? And better execute on that role. So this feels like it's been an ongoing theme in my own professional career. But I definitely think that over years, I've found myself continually working with central office leaders, especially the big division and department leaders, on understanding what their work looks like when it's done equitably, right? What does equity focused leadership look like for you if you are the head of HR, if you are the head of finance, if you are the head of transportation, if you are the head of the literacy department, right? Like, what does it mean for me to be leading for equity in my role? We used to, at least, well, both in Chicago and Madison, we regularly got central office, everybody together, everyone in every role, together to reconnect to why our work matters, like how it is either enabling or constraining excellent teaching and learning. Like quarterly, we would have these big meetings and kind of revisit that idea. But the one that stands out to the most to me, honestly, Meredith, is the idea of central office working in partnership with school principals. I remember when I first heard you talk about that and had that same discussion with central office leaders, that they struggled with it a little bit. They struggled with the principal as potential client. And I would especially like you to speak to that principle, because I think it's different.
For sure, yeah. And so what you're describing is really what we have, the kind of work we have the opportunity to study, right? So you're talking about being in your system and recognizing that the entire system needs to work in service of equitable teaching and learning, that which some people hear as kind of a negative thing or like too challenging, but it's really a strengths-based way of saying you all matter. And we need to make sure the work you're doing is the right work. So there was a lot of what you're saying, engagement of staff to figure out like what could your work look like if it were advancing equitable teaching and learning. And in almost every single unit, in the buildings and grounds unit, and HR and teaching and learning, there was somebody or some team of people in larger systems who principals always said, we want them. We want them to be our person. We want them helping us. And part of what the transformation reform was to really elevate the leadership of those people to identify what they're doing that was working, and then engage their colleagues in thinking through how can we work differently. So that a lot of that happened like within traditional work areas, like the people who provided professional development to schools did that work, and the HR analysts did that work. But what got really powerful is when they said the entire system needs to work in service of equitable teaching and learning. So the next work was, okay, we have an initial conception of what our work looks like, but if we work in that way, our work alone isn't enough to get there. So how do we think about our working as an entire system? Because otherwise you get all these different parts of the central office trying to get into schools to help, and it gets really unstrategic. So part of this was to really be much more strategic, which I do think is related to your calling out the partnership with principal piece, because it's really about not just saying each one of us can be in better service to principals, but we are going to partner with ourselves in the central office and bring principals in to think through kind of how we can all work together as a system. And I think it's also, working in partnership with principals also means really just recognizing the key role of principals. So, central office transformation is not a top-down reform of the central office saying, hey, principals, now you do this.
Right.
It's also not bottom-up reform where you ask principals what they need, because then you'll get a bunch of answers. And most principals I know, when we have asked them this, because Lydia and I did some research on school autonomy initiatives, and so that was all about central office staff asking principals, what do you need? And then they'll do that. And the number one thing principals said, nothing. Please don't, please
Leave me
stay
alone.
away. But then when you give them permission or create space for them to want something or to imagine what a support system could look like, how their supervisor could be a partner with them, which is something they hadn't even maybe thought of before, they have some pretty strategic answers. So, a lot
Yeah.
of this work around the partnership between central office and principals is for everyone to start to imagine what's possible and for everyone to kind of see themselves on the same team. There's one quote in our research that I love where a principal said, "This is one of the first times I've been in a district where I feel like we're all rowing in the same direction."
That is excellent. And it's funny that we're having this conversation, Meredith, because I was just in the EDLD course that I teach called Leaders of Learning. And we had an in-depth conversation about what principals do with their teams to design the school day, right? Like the school schedule, who teaches, which teachers, when, where, and on what, like the puzzle, right, of the school day and the school year. As you can imagine, and know, it is extraordinarily complicated work and complex. And then we got into this conversation about, okay, what could central office do, right, to maximize their ability to do that well, right, while minimizing, distractions, minimizing barriers, right, et cetera. And it was a tough conversation, right? Yeah, I mean, it was really tough. And so I want to get actually a little more granular with you because in the book, like it's broken down by, really kind of major functions in central office. And you demonstrate in the book what transformation looks like from delivery to development in the teaching and learning division, from staffing to strategy in the human resources division, from principal supervision to support, from operations to opportunity, from telling to teaching and learning on the superintendent's cabinet. Like you kind of demonstrate what transformation looks like in all these kind of key functions. But if we could just focus on the teaching and learning division for a minute, I would really love for you to kind of break down, like, what does transformation look like in the teaching and learning division? Or what are we coming from and where are we going to? And I will be thinking about this instructional design conversation we just had with my class as you talk, and I hope they will too, because they're listening in. Go ahead,
That
Mary.
sounds great. And please bring in illustrations of work you did that was consistent with this, because I
Yeah,
know,
will do.
you did. So, to the teaching and learning function, and I will be brief, don't worry. The teaching and learning function of central offices varies. It's probably one of the most variable parts of a central office in terms of what's in it. And in smaller systems, it can be one person. In larger systems, it's hundreds. Some of the functions are in HR. But the functions that we put in that chapter under teaching and learning include teacher professional development, school improvement planning, curricular programs, and data, working with data. And typically those departments, those areas of work of the central office, they are definitely the historical accumulation of federal funding, state funding, different initiatives. When Title I funding became available, we got a Title I director, and then there was math initiatives, and then they became STEM initiatives. And so we staffed that up, or in a smaller system, we added those responsibilities on to the same 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people.
Yep.
Without really rethinking the whole. So as a result, those functions typically are really uncoordinated, and there's also a lot of competition for limited resources like teacher time for professional learning and substitute teachers in districts that rely on substitute teachers, those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
And they work alone, right? So they push with professional development as a main lever of change, when in any other industry, they start with staffing and thinking about, do we have the right people in the right seats with the right colleagues so they can be successful? But HR and teaching and learning typically operate separately. So that in the districts that we worked with, they said, let's start from what we know about how people learn. And people learn not when we do the kinds of things teaching and learning staff typically do. Teachers don't learn when you pull them out of their classroom, stick them in a seat in a central office or at another person's school and deliver a bunch of things to them. They get information and sometimes they express satisfaction and exit tickets from these things. But when it comes to really shifting their practice in some of the deep ways that teachers need to, when we talk about deeper learning and culturally responsive teaching and learning, they really got to be agents of their own learning. But the values, the underlying assumptions of teacher learning in districts typically assume if we deliver this PD to teachers, then they'll grow, versus if we elevate teachers' agency to lead their own learning in a common direction,
Yeah.
right? So this is not like whatever, anything goes, right? There's a common district-wide direction with support from colleagues, to learn throughout their day. Then the lid's off, because in a lot of districts, they'll say, well, we just don't have enough time for learning. But in a hospital, in a law firm, in a grocery store, like learning happens on the job throughout people's days. But we don't do the same for teachers, right? So the new ideas, which in some districts, thankfully, are not new ideas, like people know these things, they just got these jobs and systems where they're doing something else, is to say, okay, we need to start from building systems that can help teachers lead their own learning. So that starts with a really robust professional and growth planning process that's anchored in a clear definition of the kinds of teaching practices that actually help diverse students grow. And then the professional learning community becomes a true community of practice where teachers also have the support they need to learn well together. Because a lot of PLC work, professional learning community work, is around planning teaching versus supporting teacher learning. So part of the shift is to help make those units really learning units. And part of that starts with staffing, making sure each team has the experience, the expertise it needs so they can grow well together. And then, so teaching and learning in the districts we studied really shifted from the delivery of services to the building of that kind of capacity for teachers to lead their own learning. They had to redirect some of those resources. And then they said, well, how are we supposed to know how to support schools? And the school improvement plan, they would look to those and see, oh, we remember when we were principals, we just took that to a coffee shop, or we just did it on the weekend in our free time. We just filled out the boxes and sent it in. But what if those reports were actually good intel? What if they provided great information for us about what schools need? So the districts we studied were in the process of redesigning the SIP, again, from teachers on up. So the SIP didn't get done to teachers. Professional development wasn't getting done to teachers, but teachers and their teams were trying to lead their own learning, identifying learning supports they needed that they didn't have on their teams, and then servicing that for the school improvement plan discussion. And that all becomes, so the school improvement planning process becomes not just what are we doing for students, but given what we're trying to realize for students, where are our teachers in their readiness to be successful with that? And let's have a plan for supporting their success. And many school improvement planning processes don't include that adult piece.
Right.
And then you're in the central office, and then you're having a very different conversation with your principal, because your orientation is to support capacity building for leading your own learning at the school level, not do PD to schools. And the principal and their leadership team are just getting smarter and smarter about what their teachers actually need. And all principals always know, like they have a gut sense, but principals tell us over and over again, I had a hunch of this, but I really got the data from teachers and it reaffirmed my thinking, or it challenged my thinking, extended my thinking. So that kind of rich data conversation about teaching practice is part of the shift. And then the central office thinks about how can we staff those teams so they can lead their own learning. And then we'll provide some targeted assistance to each school. Not everything. We can't blanket
Right.
schools with all
Right.
this support, because the more support, the less support. There must be a Murphy's Law about that. Right. Well, how does that, let me challenge you for an example from your practice, because I know you have one.
Well, I mean, I have so much bouncing around in my head as I hear you talk, Meredith, but I actually want us to go into some of these questions. So I'll just say quickly that your example, well, there's so much in what you just said. Your example of using something as seemingly mundane as a school improvement plan and the related school improvement planning process as a lever for rethinking the relationship between central office and schools really resonates for me. And I definitely used it in that way, as a tool for empowerment, right? For school empowerment, so that schools were truly designing a plan that would help them improve teaching and learning, and relatedly, the capacity of adults to deliver, right, on that teaching and learning. But a tool for insight to central office, but also a tool for like reciprocity. So for, maybe you taught me this, Meredith, I don't know. Now I'm maybe taking credit for something that you told me to do years ago, which is totally possible. But I know we decided when we revamped our school improvement process for these exact reasons, we also had an attendant plan for the central office departments. So for every school, there was an attended like school support plan that central office was held accountable for by schools. And which is a really good lead in actually to one of the questions. I'm going to go to the questions that I'm seeing come up in the Q&A. And there's one question that picks up right where I left off. This is from one of our EDLD students. It says, what are some examples and potentially non-examples of ways that central office leaders can measure the impact of the supports they provide, right? So let's say that they do have a central office, like a support plan for schools. How do we know whether or not central office is like, how do we know if they're doing their work well? We're really good at measuring schools, aren't we?
Yeah.
Maybe not so good at measuring central office effectiveness.
Yeah. And again, Jen, I'll invite your thoughts about this too. In our book, we talk about measures of performance that are relevant to what each person is doing, right? So it's not meaningful to hold buildings and grounds accountable for improvements in student achievement. It's also actually not always meaningful to hold the teaching and learning professional development people accountable for that either. There's so much in between that needs to happen. And there's so many other influences besides schools that influence test scores and other things that we continue to relentlessly insist on measuring. So in the districts we studied, the staff themselves really came up with performance metrics. And at first, many of these related to efficiency things like speed of response. But eventually they became much more related to teaching and learning. The challenge to them was, can you relate what you're doing to teaching and learning improvement in a meaningful way? So for example, buildings and ground staff in one of our districts, they were documenting the increased speed with which they responded to principals.
Yes.
As well as they're being proactive with principals, right? To make sure that they weren't even taking a minute of principal's time, but then they can add up those minutes and say, we have just created the potential for this amount of time by principals to be reinvested in teaching and learning.
I love that. I think that's terrific. Yeah, I know we did a lot of thinking about this question. And in addition to some of the things that you talked about, people kind of defining their own metrics, we did do like a regular survey of principals. I don't remember how frequently it was. It was at least once a year, by department. And encourage school-based teams to kind of rate our service quality, efficiency, and I don't remember exactly what the categories were, but people found that information to be really useful and helpful. So
For sure. And we had the districts we studied had satisfaction surveys also. And what was really important was that they didn't just have them, but they used them like in a real, like
Oh, yeah.
to support central office staff in getting better.
Right, which goes to another question. There's one here about capacity building of central office. This is the question. It says, new values may drive new functions that require new skills that present central office staff may or may not have. Are there examples of where transformation was possible and co-constructed to leverage and build capacity? So this is something about like, how do you actually build people's capacity to function in a new way?
Yeah.
That's how I'm interpreting that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the central office transformation stories that we tell are co-construction stories. There's stories of saying, oh, this person has shown a way forward in terms of what the new work is. Here's what the new work is. Let's start from there and invite staff to think about their readiness to work in those ways and identify their learning needs. And so the cabinet members, superintendents, chief operations officers, chief academic officers made investments in central office staff in ways they hadn't before. So, in one district, they created a pathway to get associate's degrees for certain staff who had hit so many barriers with access to higher education. And, part of that started with asking central office staff, what do you need? I mean, in districts with great responsive cultures, we find central office senior leaders asking schools all the time, what do you need, but not asking their own staff. And so let's shine that same, humanistic light on our own immediate reports. And so much of what really helped build capacity at the central office level, like you said, the simple things we have, like the mundane, like having a new school improvement planning process, showing staff what their work is just a huge resource for staff. Like I in the book, we have this example of an HR staff person saying, oh, like basically I was shown to my desk, given a handbook and said, get to work. And one time I presented that example to a team in an HR unit in a district, and someone said, that's amazing. I said, what do you mean? Because you're left. What I thought they meant was like, that isn't that horrible? And they said, no, it's amazing that they even had a handbook.
Right.
So
yes,
a lot of what these
true.
districts, these leaders were doing was saying like, as we discover what the new work is, let's make it really visible and let's help staff know what they're trying to do and move in that direction. I mean, it's what we know to do, and we often don't make that kind of investment in our own central office people. And then, sure, there are some people who were hired to work in a central office that I say this all the time, but it's not the central office we now need, and their skill set is suited to the old way. And there's plenty of roles those people can play in transition to keep running the system that a district has while transitioning to the new one. And we also find many of those people are close to retirement. And so I guess the key I want to say is the central office leaders really tried to build capacity of their staff by caring for them.
Yeah.
And so when it was not uncommon for them when they were dealing with a staff person whose skill set was outdated, given what the transformation work was, to say to them, hey, what do you think? Like, is this even a job, this new job? Do you want to even do it? Can we find you another position? Like, what makes sense for you? And some of those people decided to retire early. some of those people said, that's a really great challenge. Like in my last years here, I'd love to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
More often than not, and than not, though, we hear from central office staff, the work now, the work of being in a transforming system is the work I came into a central office to do.
Right.
So they have the capacity. It's like it's just been dormant, right?
Mm.
So it's like central office transformation provides spaces for people to wake that up.
Oh, yeah. I mean, all of it. I love everything you're saying, Meredith. I can think of specific individuals whose professional lives were made kind of fresh and new and vibrant because they found new meaning in what they were doing in food services, in the enrollment office, and right, you name it, because they could see the connection to equitable teaching and learning, to your point. I want to try to fit in one or possibly even two more questions, Meredith. And one is this: what advice would you have for central office employees trying to lead for more central office transformation and coherence without a lot of collegial support for it? So imagine, the cabinet is not leading the charge. You're the head of a department, though, and you yourself are interested in working in some new ways. Like, what's your advice if you don't have the institutional support to make these changes?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask what is in your span of control? What can you do? What can you make? I find central office staff have been so stuck in the systems they're in, they sometimes lose sight of the discretion they have to start new ways of working, to pilot things, to show what's possible. I mean, educators typically want to see something, like they want to see it in practice, they want to feel it, they want to try it out. So, I mean, I would say just try and engage as best you can, but just keep going. And I say that aware of different opportunities different staff people have to do that. I mean, we work with all kinds of leaders, especially like as you and I are, working to diversify the racial makeup, the gender makeup of the superintendency, that, leaders of color often have had experiences that are so important to be kind of informing the work, and many of them are in a pipeline toward the superintendency, so they're not quite there yet. And there's a dilemma, right? So we're going to get the job, probably the superintendency or the next job, by demonstrating our proficiency with the system we have, but it's not the system we need. So how do you manage that dilemma? And I love the efforts across the country through AASA and others to really like bring people together in affinity groups, racial affinity groups, gender affinity groups, to really think about how to support each other in building those kinds of systems. But there is someone who was in one of my first studies, he used to say, there's just a crash and burn element to the right work in school systems. You have to be willing to crash and burn. You have to push it as far as you can. And it might crash and burn. It probably will, but you have created something that people coming next can use as an example. But often those are personal choices for people in systems to kind of figure out their support system for that kind of ambitious, challenging, and risky work.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, actually, Meredith, if it's okay, because it seems very timely and maybe a good question to end on in our last few minutes. So this is going to be tough to be pithy, maybe, but let's try. One of the comments in the chat is about the change in presidential administration and concerns about what that may bring, especially when it comes to ideas on gender and race in schools. Given your commitment to equitable teaching and learning, right, and your belief in central offices, inherent commitment to equitable teaching and learning, I guess I'm curious about what should central office leaders be thinking about, especially given where they're positioned, as this new administration steps in. What do you think?
Yes, I appreciate that question. I mean, we can have a longer conversation about this.
Yeah.
You can buy the lunch, but in the meantime, I would say a main theme of the incoming administration is local authority, local leadership. So let's go.
Yeah,
Now's the time.
take advantage of it.
Yeah. And you know, locally, let's figure out what that means for our communities. And I also think a theme from the election, which other people have highlighted, is much of America feels unheard, unsupported, uncared for. You know, school systems or places that can turn that around. And so, I mean, I think now more than ever, the right work's the right work. And diversity, you know, multiple cultures, multiple, you know, cultural resources, they're powerful resources for strengthening communities. And so maybe that's a bipartisan position we can agree on.
I appreciate that answer, Meredith. Yeah, central offices, school districts are positioned in a way to move forward on their community's shared values.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, there's plenty of research that shows a declining interest in school choice. I mean, people want their public school system to be good.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, the mandate for strong public school systems that are serving the public is stronger than ever.
All right, Meredith, that's a good note to end on, I think. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We couldn't get to all the questions as usual, but we got through quite a few of them. Mayanne?
Yes, thank you so much, Meredith, Jennifer, Shannon. This is our final book talk of 2024, but we'll be back next year, so stay tuned. And thank you.